In the final moments of life, some inmates face the consequences of their actions with regret, while others remain defiant. Their stories are marked by violence, betrayal, and the deep scars left on families. Today, we'll explore the high-profile inmates executed in February 2025, delving into their crimes, their last meals, and the final words or reactions that would echo in the hearts of those who survived them. What does justice look like when it meets its ultimate conclusion? James Dennis Ford. On February 13th, 2025, at 6:19 p.m., James Dennis Ford, 64, was executed at Florida State Prison. His execution was the first in Florida in 2025, marking a significant moment in a case that had been nearly 3 decades in the making. Ford was convicted of the brutal murders of Gregory Malnery, 25, and his wife Kimberly Malnery, 26. The couple was killed during a fishing trip in southwest Florida's Charlotte County in 1997. What started as an ordinary day quickly escalated into a horrifying act of violence that would forever alter the lives of those involved. Ford shot Gregory Malnery in the head with a .22 caliber rifle, then used a blunt instrument, possibly an axe, to bludgeon him. Kimberly Malnery wasn't spared. She was raped, shot with the same rifle, and left to die beside her husband. But the horror didn't end there. The couple's 22-month-old daughter witnessed the entire attack. Strapped into her seat in their open pickup truck, she was forced to endure an 18-hour ordeal alone, covered in her mother's blood and suffering from insect bites before workers discovered the crime scene. The child survived, but the trauma she experienced would haunt her forever. Ford's crime was a calculated and cold act, driven by motives that remain murky. Investigators would later find overwhelming evidence tying Ford to the murders. The rifle used in the killings, DNA evidence, and the testimony of Ford's own statements. Despite his initial claim that he had left the couple alive, the facts told a much darker story. After a lengthy trial and multiple appeals, Ford was sentenced to death in 1999. But his time on death row wasn't short. He spent the years fighting against his conviction, claiming that his intellectual disability, his IQ hovering around 65, should have exempted him from the death penalty. However, his appeals were repeatedly denied, and the Florida Supreme Court upheld the ruling, declaring him eligible for execution. In the final moments of his life, Ford was offered a last meal. He requested a steak, macaroni and cheese, fried okra, sweet potato, pumpkin pie, and sweet tea. A simple request, yet a final glimpse of the man before the state delivered its judgment. As the execution began, Ford showed no outward signs of emotion. He lay strapped to the gurney, staring at the ceiling as the lethal injection took effect. When asked for his last words, Ford's voice, though calm, carried the weight of a lifetime of decisions. He wrote a note that read, "Hugs, prayer, love. God bless everyone." And with those words, Ford's life came to an end. Richard Lee Tabler. On February 13th, 2025, Richard Lee Tabler, 46, was executed at Huntsville State Penitentiary in Texas. His execution marked the end of a long legal battle following a series of violent crimes that left families shattered and the community reeling. Tabler was convicted for his role in the brutal murders of Mohammed Amine Ramouni, 28, and Haitham Zayed, 25, in November 2004. The two men were lured into a deadly trap by Tabler and his accomplice, Timothy Doan Payne. The pair had planned a meeting with Ramouni, who was a strip club manager, and Zayed, a friend of the manager, under the pretense of selling sound equipment. But once the victims arrived at the designated location in Ken, Texas, the situation turned violent. Tabler and Payne ambushed the men, shooting Zayed first before dragging Rahmouni from his car. Payne then filmed as Tabler shot Ramouni again. This was not an act of spur-of-the-moment rage. It was cold, calculated, and deliberate. Tabler had a history with Ramouni. Ramouni had allegedly threatened Tabler's family, stating that he could have them wiped out for $10. This threat may have played a role in Tabler's decision to murder Ramouni, though Tabler himself never fully explained his motivations for the killings. The evidence was overwhelming. Forensic data, witness testimony, and the confession from Tabler about a series of other crimes pointed directly at him. In addition to the murders of Ramouni and Zayed, Tabler also confessed to the murders of Tiffany Dotson, 18, and Amanda Benefield, 16, two teenage girls who worked at the same strip club. Though these girls were never formally tried in connection to their deaths, Tabler's admission to the crimes further painted a portrait of a man whose violence seemed without end. After his arrest, Tabler was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Despite numerous appeals, his conviction remained intact. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejected his claims, and Tabler remained on death row, waiting for the inevitable date when justice would be delivered. In the days leading up to his execution, Tabler was offered a last meal. His request was simple: steak, fried chicken, fried potatoes, and gravy. These were his final choices before the state took his life. At 6:38 p.m. Central Standard Time, Tabler was strapped to the gurney at Huntsville State Penitentiary. As the lethal injection began, Tabler was given the opportunity to speak. He offered an apology, one that he had made many times before. "There is not a day that goes by that I don't regret my actions," he said. "I had no right to take your loved ones from you." Looking at the relatives of his victims, Tabler continued, expressing his hope that they would one day find it in their hearts to forgive him. "No amount of my apologies will ever return them to you," he added. The weight of his words felt deeply by those in the room. He also expressed gratitude towards his family, his legal team, and the prison officials, thanking them for the opportunity to show that he had changed. "This is the beginning of a new life for me in heaven," he said. And with that, the drugs began to take effect. His chest rose and fell rapidly, and soon all movement ceased. Tabler's body trembled once before becoming still. He was pronounced dead 24 minutes later. Demetrius Terran. Frazier. On February 6, 2025, Demetrius Terran Frazier, 54, was executed at Holman Correctional Facility in Alabama following a brutal crime that left a mother dead and a community shaken. His execution brought closure to a case that had been dragging on for decades. Frazier's story began in 1991 when he broke into the apartment of Pauline Starks Brown, a 40-year-old woman living in Birmingham, Alabama. What followed was an act of unspeakable violence. After forcibly waking her up, Frazier demanded money and sexually assaulted Brown at gunpoint. In a final act of cruelty, he shot and killed her, stealing whatever he could find before fleeing the scene. But the story didn't end there. Just months later, in March 1992, Frazier would commit another crime in Detroit, Michigan, where he attempted to assault a young girl, Crystal Kendrick, 14. When she tried to escape, Frazier shot and killed her. His actions left families grieving and wondering how someone could commit such heinous acts. Frazier was arrested shortly after the murder of Pauline Brown and confessed to both crimes. His brutal actions, coupled with his unapologetic demeanor, led to his conviction and death sentence in 1996. In the years following his conviction, Frazier's case went through numerous appeals. But in 2025, the courts ruled to proceed with his execution. As his execution approached, Frazier was offered a last meal. He requested Taco Bell, a simple choice, burritos, and a Mountain Dew soda, a meal that reflected little of the gravity of the man's crimes. At 6:36 p.m. on the night of his execution, Frazier was strapped to the gurney, ready for his final moments. As the lethal dose of nitrogen began, he spoke for the last time. "I want to apologize to the friends and family of Pauline Brown," he said. His words were calm, but they were heavy with years of regret. What happened to her should never have happened. Frazier's apology wasn't just directed at Brown's family, it extended to his own family, the people who had supported him despite his actions. "I'm sorry for what I've done," he added, "and I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." As the drugs began to take effect, Frazier's body trembled slightly, his breathing quickened, and within moments, all movement stopped. He was pronounced dead 24 minutes later. Stephen Nelson. On February 5, 2025, Stephen Nelson, 38, was executed at the Huntsville State Penitentiary in Texas for the murders of Reverend Clint Dobson, 28, and Judy Elliott, 69, which occurred on March 3, 2011. His execution marked the end of a case that had haunted the victims' families for over a decade, offering some measure of closure, though never bringing full peace. Nelson's crime began on a seemingly ordinary day at the North Point Baptist Church in Arlington, Texas. Reverend Clint Dobson, a young pastor, and Judy Elliott, the church secretary, were at the church alone when Nelson arrived. What followed was an attack driven by the intent to rob the church. Nelson, already on parole for a previous assault, beat and strangled Reverend Dobson with a computer cable. Afterward, he suffocated Dobson with a plastic bag, ending his life in a cold and calculated manner. Judy Elliott, who was 69 years old, was also brutally attacked. She suffered facial fractures and a brain hemorrhage, but miraculously survived after a long and painful recovery. Following the killings, Nelson stole Dobson's laptop, Elliott's credit cards, and her car, using the stolen cards to buy clothing and jewelry. The investigation quickly turned toward Nelson after investigators found bloodstains on his shoes and fingerprints at the crime scene. Nelson was arrested and charged with capital murder. Though initially another man was detained, the charges against him were dropped, and Nelson became the focus of the investigation. His violent past, coupled with the evidence found, led to a swift conviction. Nelson was sentenced to death and spent years on death row fighting his conviction, but his appeals were unsuccessful. In the days before his execution, Nelson was offered a last meal. Texas, however, does not allow inmates to choose a last meal, so Nelson was provided with a standard prison meal. On the day of his execution, February 5, 2025, Nelson was led to the death chamber, where he lay strapped to the gurney. As the lethal injection began, Nelson's final words were directed to his wife, Helen Noah Dubois. He repeatedly told her, "I love you," expressing gratitude for her support over the years. His words were poignant and filled with a quiet sincerity. "I'm not afraid," Nelson said. "I'm at peace." He then added, "Enjoy life." Before the drugs took effect, Nelson said, "Let me sleep." His final words signaling a quiet acceptance of his fate. As the pentobarbital began to work its way through his system, Nelson's chest heaved several times as he struggled to breathe. Within moments, all movement stopped, and he was pronounced dead 24 minutes later. For the survivors, justice was never fully achieved in a way that could ease the pain of their loss, but Nelson's death brought an end to his reign of terror and offered them some semblance of closure. If you're still here with me, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories of justice, crime, and the consequences that follow. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light.